Order. Welcome to this morning's session of the Business and Trade Select Committee, in which we are looking at the collapse of Wilko and the lessons for policy reform at the Department for Business and Trade. Thank you very much to those witnesses who are joining us for the first panel. Our goal with this first panel is really to set the stage for the later hearings that we've got that follow you. Because time is so limited, we're just asking for really concise and punchy answers. We, as you can imagine, are briefed up to the nines, but we would really be grateful to you for helping make sure that we have got all the facts on the table before we move into our subsequent hearings. So, Nadine Houghton, perhaps I could turn to you first.
Yeah.
Just tell us very briefly, if you can, why did Wilko fail and who, if anyone, was responsible? And then I'll put the same question to Mr. O'Brien.
DNB doesn't believe that the collapse of Wilko was inevitable. We think that actually what resulted from what brought about the collapse was weak leadership and a failure of Wilko to adapt to a changing market. The consistent face on the leadership team was, of course, Lisa Wilkinson, who you'll be speaking to later. So we do believe that she bears a significant amount of responsibility. We saw under her directorship a high churn in executive directors, no CEO for a period of at least 8 years. And during this time as well, huge amounts of dividends were taken out of the business, 77 million over the past decade. Millions were taken out by Lisa Wilkinson and used for her angel investments instead of, as we would believe they should be, being invested in Wilko, to improve their online offering, to make sure that they are competitive on price, to make sure that their shops were fit for purpose. Clearly they had a lot of high street stores where their competitors were moving on to retail units. And it's those kind of changes that Wilko just really didn't adapt to.
So we've got failures there of strategic leadership, operational leadership, some financial issues, but encapsulated by a failure of leadership at the business.
Failure of leadership and a lack of accountability.
Perfect. Okay, thank you, Patrick. What's your take on that question?
My take is that Wilko's demise has to be seen in terms of longer-term competitive context. The retailer was doing quite well up until about 2012, but has really struggled over the last 10 years. This is not a problem that's just it's just happened over the last couple of years. Or indeed because of COVID or the cost of living crisis. So it's a longer term issue, and they've come up against much stronger competitors. That's in terms of supermarkets, who've pushed more into home sales. They've increased from 2% of their sales mix to over 3%. But then there's the competitive context of the likes of Home Bargains and B&M, who've grown very, very rapidly with a much more compelling offer that Wilko has had, and they've grabbed market share from Wilko, as have other players such as Savers, and to a lesser extent the likes of Hobbycraft, also Dunelm, for example, in homewares. So they've been attacked from all sides, and what it seems to me is that Wilko really was a sense of inertia. They didn't really do enough. They had the wrong store, store locations, wrong store type. They're far too big, their stores. They had lower sales densities than any of their major competitors, and they didn't really react. They kept on with a high street model. They didn't really push into retail parks at all, and that was where the likes of B&M and Home Bargains were having their successes.
How long did that inertia last? I mean, if you were to track it back over the last however many years.
Well, they ran out of room in terms of like-for-like sales growth. In 2012, their operating margin never recovered beyond 1.7% over the last 10 years, which, when their competitors were much higher. They didn't react at all, as far as I can see.
They were in a pretty unique position in 2009 after the collapse of Woolworths to help consolidate that particular sector of the market, though. Is that fair to say?
That's true, and they grew all through the early 2000s. They were one of the reasons that that Woolworths eventually collapsed. and they were growing stores all the way through to about 2014, maybe 15.
Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, just to come in, we've got correspondence between ourselves and Wilko where they identify challenging trading position from about 2010, and they identify that the discount retailers are an issue. However, what we see is instead of really leaning into that and accepting that that is a challenge, that they're actually very well placed to adapt to, as you've identified in this post-Woolworths austerity economy of sort of 2009, 2010. And actually what you see is a move away from this idea of Wilko as a value retailer, discount retailer, and actually they have this rebranding process which is completed in 2015 where they move from Wilkinson to Wilko. And the internal messaging to our members, obviously I represent team members within Wilko, was very much this attempt to move to almost a John Lewis type model. That was the internal messaging that our members on the shop floor got. It was a complete departure from the idea of Wilko as a family brand and a discount retailer. And actually under NDA in December 2022, we raised our concerns with the then CEO, Jerome St Mark, that Wilko was moving away from its roots and doing what it had done well for so many years. And he unequivocally told GMB that Wilko was not a discount retailer. And our members really chart the beginning of the end around 2014, 2015, where they just move away from this discount approach.
If we then just go forward a couple of years to say 2021, the cash position in the business remains very strong. They're recording about 107 million in net cash in 2021. When were you told as a trade union that there were problems at play?
We were not really ever directly told. We were told that there were trading difficulties. No, the consistent message that we had from Wilko was we're in a strong position, we're in a strong cash position. As you've said, they preserved a lot of cash in the bank, but we have a turnaround plan. We recognise that there's difficulties, but we have a turnaround plan. And the strap line was power to 2030. So we were consistently told we've got this robust turnaround plan, we've got lots of cash in the bank, nothing to see here, nothing to worry about. And it wasn't until there was lots of press speculation around the middle of 2022 that we actually asked for this meeting with the then CEO, Jerome St Mark, to be told, again, no problem here, we're not a discount retailer, we have a plan. And only a matter of weeks later, a new CEO is appointed, who you'll be speaking to later, Mark Jackson, and actually he did seem to have a plan. He did seem to understand what it is that Wilko needed to do in order to survive. Unfortunately, it was just too little, too late. And we found out as well from press speculation, unfortunately, that Wilko board were advised that they needed to enact a CVA in the middle of 2022 in order to bring their rents down. And again, you know, this inertia, this just inaction when something clearly needed to be done.
Now, you're under parliamentary privilege here, but I think you have also been released from an NDA.
We have, yeah.
What did you learn from that you can now share with us?
Really what I've just told you. I mean, there wasn't any, not a high level of detail. The meeting that we had with Mark Jackson was also under NDA, and that was in the January. And at that time we were told that the rents were 40% above market rates.
Wow.
So we have this picture where the board have been advised in 2022 they need to enact a CVA for various reasons, and I'm sure you'll ask Lisa later why that wasn't acted upon. We then have a meeting with the CEO who tells us everything's fine, we've got a strong cash position. And then come January 23, the new CEO is telling us, actually, our rents are 40% above market rates. And yes, we've got a turnaround plan, but clearly, as we all know, it was too little, too late.
So we've got a failure to consolidate after the collapse of Woolworths. We've then got a rebranding exercise after 2014, which is about the time that the business was bought out by Ms Wilkinson.
Right.
We've then got, frankly, a slow decline in which problems appear to snowball, but there wasn't a lot of transparency about those problems with you.
Not even so no transparency, but no acknowledgement of the issues, no humility from anybody at a board level to be able to sit back and go, actually, our strategy isn't working. The discount retailers are hugely eating into our market share. we were in a prime position to capitalise on that. Okay, we missed our chance there, but what do we need to do differently now? And actually what you see is this real digging in of, I've mentioned the sort of John Lewis type model, but that sort of culture persists, and you see that in the director churn as well.
Do you think the board of Wilkinson were in denial, or did they just not care?
I can only tell you what I pick up on anecdotally from feedback from our members, and the feedback from our members is very much that Lisa Wilkinson had an idea about how she wanted the business to be run. You see the opening of the High Street Kensington Wilko. I mean, if that doesn't speak to a vanity project, then I'm not really sure what does. You have this Winnovate extension added to the head office on an industrial estate in Worksop, which again, it just looks like a vanity project. It's completely out of place. So you see, for example, the investment in these driverless drones that as part of Lisa's angel investment strategy. So it was very much, I think, that Lisa had an idea about Wilko, what Wilko should be, but it was a complete departure from actually what Wilko is and what Wilko had always been and done well.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Palsy.
Thank you, Chairman. We've heard about leadership and failure to understand the market. I want to ask Professor Shah, if I may, about the financial aspects of Wilko. And so you're an expert in accounting and corporate governance and also regulation. I wanted to pick those two bits separately. So in terms of accounting and corporate governance, why weren't these things picked up by the auditors?
A very, very good question, and that's what I have been asking whilst looking at the accounts. PricewaterhouseCoopers were the auditors before 2019, and EY took over in 2019. Now, so these problems have been building up for some time, as my colleagues have just said. And of course, they are very simple in a way for an auditor to recognize the problems. It's not difficult because the turnover is high, but the margins are very low and they are declining. And there was a big loss in 2018 of 56 million, and it's in 2019 that PwC resigned as auditors. So what we have, as a profession, and I'm a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants, we have a duty to protect the public interest. We have a duty, we are trained to spot these kinds of problems. We are supposed to bring our expertise. We are supposed to be independent.
Professor Shah, what went wrong?
What went wrong is basically the auditors didn't do their job. If we look closely at the audit opinions, whilst PwC was an auditor, there is a section in the audit opinion called going concern. And in that section, the paragraph reads that this company is a going concern and everything is fine. However, the last sentence says, however, we cannot guarantee the future of the company because of the uncertainty that surrounds it.
Professor Shah, is this both auditors? Is this PwC in the period prior to 2019,
yeah,
as well as EY after? So two of the big four failed to do their job properly. Is that what you're telling us?
Well, without any doubt.
Without any doubt.
But if you look carefully at the way they phrased the audit report, they protected themselves. So we are hearing just now about how the family who owned the business protected themselves at the expense of the workers. Here you got auditors protecting themselves.
Tell us how they went about doing that. How were they able to protect themselves and not protect the workers and the customers and the suppliers of the business?
Well, so in the last audited accounts in 2022, when EY were the auditors, the normal period of audit is 3 months after the month end. EY waited for 9 months, which is the last deadline to publish the audit report.
Why do you think they did that?
Well, clearly because there were serious problems, and by coincidence, it so happens that the headquarters in Worksop, the distribution center, was sold the day before the audit report was signed for 50 million. So that cash injection that brought in was able to keep the organization going, right?
But we heard in 2021 the cash position was strong. Why did it deteriorate so quickly, and what was done to deal with it? The sale of the building, presumably, then?
Yeah, so I suspect, you see, we only have public information. The auditors have a lot of inside information, right? So from the public information, what I can discern is that Barclays had a loan, a temporary, a kind of working capital loan of about 25 million, and they were calling for that loan back, and the cash was very short. So they were forced to make a sale of one of their core buildings, properties, and out of that sale, effectively the auditors took comfort that, okay, temporarily there is a reprieve, right? But when you read the audit report, there is a statement where they say there is a material uncertainty relating to going concern, but then overall it says the accounts give a true and fair view of the group's affairs. Now, you know, if a company is insolvent, then the whole accounts change completely because the valuations change, right? So in a sense, when you look at the audit report, it's a bit like they've passed, but they've failed, but they've passed again, and they've failed. So when you're reading it, you're not getting a very clear indication of what is the judgment about the future of the company.
Right. So what should the auditors have written? What should they have said that they didn't say?
The accounts do not give a true and fair view. And not just in 2021, they should have said that at least 3 years
When an
earlier.
auditor sees accounts that don't give a true and fair view,
Yeah.
what action should they take? To be fair to PwC, they resigned. Is that not adequate action?
No, not at all.
What should they have done?
They should have reported it in the audit report. You know, that's when they express the opinion. We hire experts, and remember, these experts are very well paid to provide judgment and independent analysis and to help with the corporate governance of a public company, right? So they failed in doing that, clearly, but they covered themselves because I think in a court of law, they would not be able to.
They'd realised what the serious state of the company's finances was?
Very good question. Now, this very committee did a fantastic report on the future of audit in 2019, which covered all these aspects. And one of the key recommendations made by this committee was that auditors have a duty to look forward, not just backward. And they need to exercise clear judgment and be independent, right? So in this case, so what happened, if you look at the last audited accounts, the directors created projections for the cash flow of the business, and the auditors said that, look, there is uncertainty surrounding the business, but we've looked at the cash flows and we feel that the business will survive for another year until 2024. Now, the future of audit report that this committee said, the public should expect much better than that of these independent professionals. Yeah? So they didn't get it.
And how important do you think that reform is?
Oh, it's long overdue, but unfortunately, there have been fantastic reviews. The Bryden report looked at all the audit profession in detail and the kind of changes to the audit report in detail, and beautifully done, very professional. All of these reports have been put into abeyance. And the profession is not independent. You know, I mean, I've looked, the Institute of Chartered Accountants, which is the main audit professional body, they provide templates for the audit report. So auditors effectively don't have to really write the audit report. They just take a template out.
Mr. McDonald is going to ask about some of the systemic issues, but I just want to check one thing. If the company was bleeding so much cash in 2021, 2022, that Barclays was recalling its loan, it sounds like a gap was plugged at the very last minute by the sale of the distribution centre in Worksop. If you're plugging gaps with a one-off sale, that's not a going concern.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, but again, remember, so the auditors delayed the audit report by 6 months.
Presumably in order for the sale of the distribution centre to come through and the cash to arrive.
That is also not very professional, because if their duty is to protect the public interest, they should be timely, and they should be willing to exercise judgment and take risk. Otherwise, what is their job?
Okay.
What is their job?
We'll bring in Andy McDonald.
Thanks, Chair. Professor Shah, can I just develop that theme somewhat? Because when we look back, BHS 2016, Carillion, Patisserie Valerie, London Capital Finance, Thomas Cook, NMC Health and Greensill Capital, they all demonstrate major audit failures. There's been heavy criticism of the Big Four and others involved in those. But you've argued that those failures are linked to systemic failures in corporate governance, and you've called for audit reforms. Do you want to say a little bit more about those key reforms? And can I invite you to comment on the market being dominated by such a small cohort of auditors? France, I understand, has 27 players in this market, and double auditing. What are the reforms that you would want to see, and which are the urgent ones?
Yeah, I mean, there is a long list, but I'll start with the independence issue. So at the moment, these are broad-based. The Big Four are, as you rightly say, very large, have a large market share, very influential, but also they provide a whole A to Z of services. So there are plenty of conflicts of interest. Just looking at the Wilko example, PwC were the auditors, then they resigned, then they became consultants to Wilko. So they were helping them with the restructuring. There's a £500,000 bill which was unpaid at the time of the administration, and now suddenly from that they've become the insolvency practitioners, right? So and then I saw there's also Deloitte is a creditor on this. So the Big Four are helping Wilko in different ways. We found the same in Carillion, right? So all the time, where is the public interest? Where is the independence? The independence should be separated. So they should not be allowed to cross-sell services, and they should be separated. Audit should be separated, and they should be broken up. Those are simple examples. Another important thing is about the forward-looking aspect of the audit. It shouldn't just be about the past. There should be about the future, and not just 1 year into the future, but at least 3 to 5 years. Bryden review covers that, and auditors also need to be, there is also this talk about the auditors not being appointed by the company, because the company is not the client. The client is the public and the shareholders, creditors. There's a whole range of stakeholders who rely on a good quality independent audit, right? So therefore there is a talk about the public appointment of auditors. So the government appoints the auditors to different companies rather than them choosing their auditors, right? Now the point that was raised earlier about the transfer between PwC and EY, now that transfer of auditors, the only requirement is that one auditor should write to the other to make sure that there are no unforeseen risks in the business which the other auditor should be aware of. But that's a secret letter. Now, Bryden said that letter should be made public. Whenever there's a transition of auditors, we should see that. Auditors should appear in front of the AGM. At the AGM, people can ask auditors to look at particular aspects of the business which are not covered, but which are seen to be risky by the stakeholders of the business. The kinds of issues that Nadine is saying.
Now. You're saying that does not happen now?
Not at all.
No. So we've got an issue that they're not only the same people are auditors, insolvency practitioners, consultants, but they're investors as well. You're basically telling us that just is simply unsustainable as the architecture in this space.
And given that they have such access to internal information about the business on a regular basis, which the public do not have, they are supposed to do their job properly and reliably and accurately so that we can be protected, so that jobs can be protected, creditors can be protected. There are so many small creditors who lost out on this.
So given that, what's your take on the government's response to this? This is something it isn't a new area to us. This has been known. Is the current legislative framework sufficient, or is that needing urgent overhaul? And what's your sense of government's response to those appeals and the urgency with which this is being treated?
Were you as surprised as some of us that there was nothing on this in His Majesty's speech?
Very, very surprised, but actually not in a way. We live in a corporately captured economy, basically, where big business is controlling our democracy, has huge power and influence over our elections, and that is why we are where we are. And I feel that it's completely unsustainable. While we are talking about net zero and sustainability, how can an economy run by multinational corporations who are not accountable to anybody, how can we run a democracy in that kind of an economy? You know, it's just not possible. And in fact, net zero should mean net zero for multinational power and arrogance and abuse of power, really. That should be reduced, and they should be made accountable.
Just finally, I did mention a different architecture in France, because that's been brought to my attention by auditors who can't break into this market because it is cornered by in the way that you've described. Are there other examples where we don't have the Carillions and BHSs collapsing with regularity as we have since 2016 to the current day? Are there better ways to arrange your auditing and insolvency practices?
Well, you gave the example of France earlier, and that is, the joint audits is a good example. I really think that the broader issue is we've just allowed too much power to big business in this country. And
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Anthony Higginbotham.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Steinberg, can I come to you? Because it looks like you're an expert in restructuring and insolvency.
Yeah.
For most people looking in, including constituents that I've got, and I'm sure everyone's got, who worked for Wilko, once the insolvency and administration process starts, it feels like things go into a black hole. And lots of people don't know what's going on. Workers don't know whether their jobs are secure. So I wonder if we can start by you just explaining the process from when an insolvency process starts, what happens, who does what, who's responsible for communicating.
Sure, of course, yeah. I mean, there are different types of insolvency proceeding, and the type of insolvency proceeding that a company selects is largely driven by what they want to achieve next. So, in the case of administration, for example, the primary objective is to try and rescue the company as a going concern. However, there's then a cascade of subsidiary objectives. So if the administrators conclude they can't achieve the rescue of the company as a going concern, the survival of the company, then there are a sort of shopping list, if you like, of subsidiary achievements, one of which is to achieve a better outcome for the creditors than would be the case in a liquidation, try and get a distribution to the preferential creditors, if that's possible. So they will quickly make a decision as office holders as to which of those objectives they think is realistically achievable. They've usually reached that conclusion before they get appointed, particularly if they've been involved with the management before they're appointed, which they usually are. Having concluded what their objective should be, the one they should pursue, then they get about pursuing it. Now, depending on the nature of the business, they may have to move very quickly indeed. So, for example, if they want to achieve a sale of the business as a going concern, then they need to move very quickly. Because in order for the company to be sold as a going concern, it needs to continue as a going concern within administration whilst that sale is being concluded. That needs money, that needs cash, because obviously if they don't have the cash available, they can't pay the employees, they can't pay the creditors, the suppliers who they're contracting with. So they have to move very quickly. And I think a lot of the criticism about lack of information is because actually they're focusing, to be fair to the office holders, they're focusing on trying to get the business sold as a going concern rather than spraying out loads of information to creditors.
You don't think there's a transparency problem, it's a necessity?
I think it's a necessity problem, to be honest, yes. I mean, they do have to prepare reports and they do have to prepare proposals, and those will get sent out. But of course, if you're a supplier who's not been paid, or if you're an employee who doesn't know whether they're going to be employed next week, those types of statutory reports are too slow for them. So they will be relying upon daily interactions, such as they are, with the office holders and their staff about what the office holders are trying to achieve. In my experience, they're normally pretty good about that, but obviously it just depends on the size of the business. It's difficult in practice to go around and consult with employees in lots of, in the case of Wilko, for example, 400 different locations. So I think it's more driven by, I don't think the office holders are trying to hide anything. I think they're usually trying to achieve a sale as a going concern. That means they have to move very quickly. There's a certain amount of confidentiality around that as well, of course.
Okay, thank you. Just Ian Lavery briefly, and then I'll come to Stephen.
Just very briefly, I was really interested to hear what Mr. Shaw was saying. I just wonder if you would say, do you think what's happened here at Wilko, because the only people that really have been affected by this are the workforce. Everybody else has went away with a considerable money in the pot. So do you see this as a systemic failure in corporate governments, or do you think it's a failure of unbridled raw capitalism?
Probably connected, the two, but the unique feature of Wilko is that it's an owner-managed business, right? And generally speaking, owner-managed businesses have skin in the game. And in this case, there is a long history, so there should, in theory, be that respect for the workers, as Nadine has very nicely pointed out, right? Because the workers are family. And I do a lot of research on family businesses where the workers have been treated like that and are respected because they are seen as a key part of the engine of the business. Now here we have an interesting feature where that history, of course, the business has passed through generations, and that sense of loyalty and duty has not continued somehow. And just to give you an example, when I was doing the analysis of Wilko, we find in 2017, up to 2017, the family are shown as the majority owners of the group. Then after 2017, they create another group company called Amalgamated Holdings, which is now the majority owner. So therefore, legally, it allows the family to hide behind another layer of ownership structure and minimize their liability. So here, the reaction of the owners has been, and obviously they've seen the trouble coming and they've seen the risks of that, is to protect themselves at the expense of the employees. So, and again, you got advisors all over the place kind of helping these companies do these kinds of things, and especially in the case of the audit, where they have to, consultants don't necessarily have to be independent, but auditors have a duty to be independent, and as professionals, they have a duty to protect the public interest. So this is very...
Thank you. So Stephen Timms.
Can I just come in on the...
Sorry, Nadine.
So, it's just this point about a family-run business, and I just think it's a really important point that absolutely our members, I would be hard-pressed to find a group of members that so consistently spoke about the fact that Wilko felt like a family and felt like a second family to them, and absolutely that loyalty, that two-way interaction. There was at the period under the previous family ownership before it became Lisa's, before she became the majority owner, was our members describe a period of good pay and conditions, feeling respected, feeling like, as you said, they had some skin in the game, they had a bit of freedom in terms of how they run their stores, they were trusted. And what happens is in that interaction is that both sides, if you like, get to thrive. There's 115 years of collective length of service sitting behind me right now with just seven Wilko colleagues. And we've spoken about the impact of all of this. The reality is that 12,000 hardworking people lost their jobs as a result of all of these catalogue of failures that, I'm sure we're going to hear more about. But really that multi-generational family that it was part of Wilko is something that I just haven't heard in any other employer that I deal with.
We'll come back to how they're feeling before Christmas, but let me just bring in Sir Stephen Timms on this question around.
Thank you. Can I come back to Mr. Sternberg? Can you just explain to us, in a situation like the Wilko situation, how is it decided how the assets that are left should be distributed amongst the various creditors, and in particular, what priority is there for making up a shortfall in the pension fund?
Sure. There's the order in which you make payments out is governed by statute. So if you are a secured creditor, if you've got fixed charge security, like a mortgage over property, for example, you have first dibs on the assets over which you have security. After that, you're looking at the administrator's fees and expenses. The unsecured creditors, and that would include a deficit on the pension scheme, they are, if you like, at the bottom of the, well, not at the bottom of the pile, shareholders are at the bottom of the pile, but there are certain creditors who rank ahead of the unsecured creditors. So there's the secured creditors, certain preferential creditors, so employees for about £800 of back pay and holiday pay. HMRC, for example, is preferred in respect of certain taxes, but not all of them. VAT principally, and national insurance contributions if they haven't been paid, and various other bits and bobs. Not corporation tax if there's any owing, but there usually isn't because there aren't any profits. And you're then into the unsecured creditors. So the pension scheme, where there is a deficit on the pension scheme, they rank as unsecured alongside the other unsecured creditors.
Do you think there's a case for promoting the pension scheme deficit in that priority list?
Well, that's a matter of policy. In some of the corporate failures, what I would say is in some of the corporate failures, that's been a very big number. Because part of the problem is when a company becomes insolvent, the way in which you calculate the deficit on the pension scheme changes and produces a sort of hyper-conservative number, which is therefore a very big number. It's a policy decision as to whether or not you should.
Can I just check with Nadine? You've written to the pensions regulator, I think, asking them to use their anti-avoidance powers to increase the resources in the pension scheme. Have you had a response from the pensions regulator on that?
Not as far as I'm aware, but clearly we're hoping as a result of their investigation that they do find that that Lisa Wilkinson does have to reimburse the pension scheme. We actually make the deficit 56 million with 20 million secured against one of the DCs, which I don't believe has been sold yet.
Thank you. Nigel, did you want to come in?
I just asked maybe Mr. Steinberg or Professor Sharp. I think when I was last guesting on this committee, we were looking at Carillion, and the problem where there with the auditors didn't seem to spot there was a problem, whereas here they did spot there was a problem and disclosed that the company may not be able to get past January 24. What would have happened if they'd said, no, you can't use the going concern basis of accounting, you've got to use, I think it's called break-up accounting, break-up valuation. I mean, would that have meant that they'd have had to have shown all 400 odd leases as onerous, and wouldn't you have just tipped the company straight into administration at that point?
Well, I mean, as I said to you, 4 years before, the auditors were sneakily warning that there is significant underlying risk in the future survival of the company. But I don't know how many people were reading the audit report in detail, but they started, that's quite unusual. In the going concern paragraph, they were warning, right? So if people didn't notice that, then it's kind of their problem. But if they had written that, yes, that would mean basically that the accounts do not give a true and fair view, and the value, as a result, we do not think this is a going concern, and therefore the valuations in the balance sheet need to change. Now, as to how much the duty of the auditors is to provide the new valuations is unclear at the moment in the rules and regulations. But at least they have a duty to qualify the accounts, and they should call it a qualified opinion and say that they do not give a true and fair view. Now, as to whether this will trigger a bankruptcy or an insolvency, that's not necessarily the problem of the auditors. That's the problem of society. And in a sense, they are there as independent assessors and judges. And they ought to act with that independence, integrity, and professionalism and give a timely warning. You know, so that's my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. Finally.
Thank you, Chair. I'll come back to you, Mr. Steinberg. In September, the government proposed reforms of the insolvency sector. A key tenet of that was bringing full regulation to the sector. But we've also heard today that a similarly regulated sector, the audit sector, failed pretty spectacularly here. So I just want your view on the adequacy of the proposals that government made in September.
Well, I think the government's proposals, they cover a number of different areas, but on the regulatory side, as matters currently stand, the insolvency profession in the UK are, if you like, they're self-regulated. There are a number of professional bodies who regulate insolvency practitioners, and there is a kind of monitoring supervisory role for the insolvency service that sits above that, but it's fairly limited. Now, the law reforms that have been proposed, one of them was that the self-regulatory bodies, if you like, of the profession would be replaced by a single unitary regulator who would be the government, who would be the insolvency service. Now, that was in the consultation. As I understand it, in the proposals that are coming out, the legislature will reserve to itself the ability to impose that, but for the time being, I think the idea is the insolvency service will work closely with the self-regulatory bodies, the professional bodies, I think with a view, you could call it a last chance saloon, but with a view to trying to get them to up their game and improve their processes. And if they can, then the idea is that they could carry on performing it. But if they can't, then a single unitary government regulator would be imposed. Now, as to whether that's a good idea or not, in part it's about resources. Okay, I mean, you can pass the law saying there's a government regulator, but in order for that to be effective, in order for that to make a difference, there would need to be resources behind that. You need to have good people working there. They would need to be on the case of these various office holders. Now, one of the related reforms, which I think will help, is that at the moment, because insolvency office holders, when they take appointments, they're personal to them as individuals. So even if they're a partner in a Big Four firm or in one of the second-tier firms, actually it's they as individuals who are appointed, not the firms. Yeah. And so it is they as individuals who are regulated. Now, there is a view for some time that that's not really sufficient, because the reality is it's the firm of which they're a partner that provides all the ballast and all the resource, which is what happens in these cases. So one of the other key reforms which is being proposed is that the firms themselves should be regulated as far as their provision of insolvency services is concerned. And I think that's a good idea. Whether that makes a difference or not, I don't know. It's a sensible.
Slightly against this, Mr. Steinberg. Anything else you wanted to just...
So would you describe it as evolution of the current approach or revolution? And do you think that's right? Should we be more ambitious? Do we need to be more ambitious given the corporate failings we've seen before?
As far as insolvency practitioners are concerned, I think it is evolution rather than revolution, but I think that's right. Now, a lot of the criticism which Professor Shah has been directing has been at the auditing profession, and there are issues about independence and doing the both. I think the insolvency profession, my experience is actually they tend to do a pretty good job. There are, you get bad apples and you get poor instances, and they do get pulled up.
The average hourly rate is £950 an hour for PwC doing the insolvency of Wilko. I just checked the latest report. £950 an hour. A professor of accounting earns about £300 a day if they are lucky.
Mr. Steinberg, I just want to crystallise this, please. So your view is that evolution of the profession is, and that evolution of the regulation is required?
I think evolution is required, because I think those two, I think particularly the decision to regulate firms is a good idea. Okay. But evolution, not revolution.
Right, let me just wrap up this first panel then. Just, Patrick, was there a strategy under which Wilko could have survived and continued to be in business today?
You mean if they had taken very different decisions 9, 10 years ago?
Yeah.
Yes.
Or indeed more recently?
Yes, definitely. I think if they would have had to have started quite a while ago, they would have had to have looked at their store portfolio and start moving that. It's very difficult. We've seen a lot of retailers fail over the last 10 years, and a lot of the inertia is down to the fact that they've plugged into long leases, which then are very expensive for them to get out of. Yeah. So they stay put and hope for the best, and that's kind of what we've seen across retail over the last 10 years.
This wasn't inevitable.
No, not at all. I mean, they're in the value discount sector. That's an area all through the last 10 years of austerity, that they have a real opportunity because people are trading down from the mid-market into cheaper retailers, as they're continuing to do at the moment. So there was definitely an opportunity for them.
Nadine, finally, what kind of Christmas are Wilko's former workers looking forward to now?
I think ordinarily our members in Wilko would have been looking forward to working the Christmas period with their colleagues, the colleagues that they describe as a second family. I do know that some of our members have gone on to get jobs in B&M and Poundland. They've maintained similar employment. But as I said, it really is that sense of a loss of family that so many of them describe as being the real crux of the issue here. And Lisa Wilkinson hasn't even bothered to offer an acknowledgement, let alone an apology, let alone a visit to one of the stores or one of the distribution centres to say, guys, I'm sorry that it came to this. And to me, that just, I can't understand why, if you've had this family business that you've been part of for so long, that you wouldn't have the common decency to even come and give an acknowledgement to your workforce in the face of what's been one of the most difficult challenges that many of them have had to face in their lifetime.
Thank you very much to all of our witnesses. You've set the stage very well for our subsequent panels. I'm very grateful to you for your time and for the briefing work that you've done with the committee. That concludes this session. Order.
The proceeding is currently suspended.
Welcome to this second panel of the Select Committee on Business and Trade, looking at the collapse of Wilko and the lessons for policy reform at the Department for Trade and Business. Thank you very much indeed to all of you for joining us today. That's much appreciated. We're seeking to learn the lessons from the collapse of Wilko and what that means for the programme of reform at His Majesty's Government. Ms Wilkinson, perhaps I could start with you. Could you tell the committee, did your greed bankrupt Wilko?
I don't believe so, no.
Do you want to just tell us why Wilko collapsed?
Would you like me to do that or Mark?
I would like your perspective first, please.
Okay. So, in essence, Wilko failed because we ran out of cash. That's what caused the downfall in the end. There were a lot of contributory factors that led to that over quite a long period of time, and clearly we had a strategy to deal with those factors that were hitting us, but Wilko went out of business before that strategy was fully implemented. There were a series of external factors and there were a series of internal factors, and I'm mindful that you'll want me to keep my answers short, so I need to try and do that. Externally, we're all familiar with the landscape. We had declining high streets, and Wilko is very much a high street-based stores retailer, was very much a high street-based stores retailer with long leases and high rents that kept us on those high streets. We, of course, faced the cost of business rates. We faced COVID like all businesses did, and during COVID we stayed open. We didn't furlough any team members, and I like to think that we were supportive of team members who had high risk because of medical conditions they had. We also, I think, relatively unusually paid our landlords in full throughout COVID. So the things we took advantage of were the delays in paying VAT, which we paid off, and the business rates concessions. But other than that, we stayed open during COVID and covered our costs. And I think there's some debate that Mark will bring into the picture about whether we should or shouldn't have done that, but we did. We were about to enter in, we aren't a business with a history of debt. So if you look at our accounts, which are publicly available at Companies House, we don't have a history of carrying debt. And then during 2022, we were trying to move from a revolving credit facility, which we didn't use, but to a more secured debt position. We were about to enter into secured lending arrangements with Macquarie when the 2022 mini-budget happened. Literally, we were in the midst of that. And at that point, the interest terms on that loan were hiked massively, and that became infeasible. And so that was a contributor externally. Financially, our revenues were falling faster than our cost base could be reduced, which was eroding cash, as you can see in the figures for 2022. We lost the confidence, sadly, of key allies. So we lost the confidence of Lloyds Bank, which had been our bank for 90 years, and they pulled away from us in 2022. We lost the confidence of the credit assurers, who pulled away from us in autumn 2022. We got some amazing support from some of our goods for resale and goods not for resale suppliers, but we didn't get support from enough of them to sustain us through that. We couldn't manage to obtain the further inward investment we needed, either by way of debt or equity, to continue to trade and implement our strategy. Our customers, and you can see this in the figures over time, have gradually reduced shopping with Wilko. Lots of people have their theories as to why. Some on my list, if you're interested, are that we failed to grow and scale our online business. The cost of living crisis clearly reduced our sales. We had big internal challenges around product availability that was caused by many internal difficulties to do with things like lorry driver shortage, distribution centres, infrastructure changes, lack of credit assurance and low supplier confidence. We had moved to a position where we had an unclear customer proposition, and I've heard some of the statements people have made as against the discounters. We're a value retailer, but our proposition was unclear against the discounters. We failed to satisfactorily address our category and product offer and move to something different and better. We had huge pressure on margin rate, spiralling costs, and I think it's been alluded to that Wilko was over-rented on the high street, and we had weak processes and infrastructure. I'm sure there are more, sir, but those are the ones in my mind.
That's a long list of failures, and the failure of that strategy has now left the taxpayer on the hook for over £40 million worth of financial support for those made redundant. We have a pension fund deficit of over £50 million, and we have creditors who are at best going to see 4p in the pound on the debts that Wilko owes to them. Do you want to just take this moment to apologise to those workers who are facing Christmas without work?
So I am thankful to so many people for so many things that they have done to help Wilko, not least amongst those the fantastic team members that have always worked at Wilko, the amazing suppliers and advisors who have supported us, and of course, top of that list has got to be the fantastic customers who shopped with us for over 90 years in our stores. I am devastated that we have let each and every one of those people down with the insolvency that Wilko has done. I don't know how to put into words how sad I am that we have let down all our customers, all our team members, our suppliers, our advisors. Genuinely, I don't know what you want me to say, but I have always gone on record.
Sorry was the one word I was looking for.
You can have the word sorry, of course. I'm sorry if you wish me to say the word sorry.
I wanted just to give you that opportunity.
No, I thought devastated covered it. I apologise. I wasn't trying to be clever. I am sorry that we are not there supporting all those people anymore.
It was a long list of problems that you identified, from the Prime Minister's budget through to the partners that you had, for example, your financial partners. What were the mistakes that you made?
What would I do differently if I had the time again? It's a question I ask myself all the time. I would do differently that year, that was 2022. We started out that year not as strong as we should have done, but strong. We had positive cash, we had positive EBITDA, we had decent trading sales, we had no debt position at all at the beginning of 2022. And in each 4-week period of 2022, by trading down on our numbers, we were eroding cash. So the first thing I would like to do differently, if I could, was be more proactive on that declining sales that was dropping into cash through 2022. The next two things are a popularity vote, I'm afraid. I wish I had brought Mark in earlier. I think he could have made a difference if we had brought him in earlier. And I wish I had taken the advice of PricewaterhouseCoopers earlier. Those are the three things that I wish I had done earlier.
Mr. MacDonald.
Thank you, Chair. Well, indeed, the problems didn't start in 2022, of course. PwC had already identified issues. Just something that came out in the previous session, I just want to clear up, if I could. The last set of accounts for the year 29th of January 2022 was signed off by EY in November of 2022. Now, if the business wasn't sustainable at that point, what was the conversation going on in that interim period opposite the sale of a major asset to try to improve the situation? Was there a conversation about trying to make the picture look a little bit better with the sale of a major asset?
So, I am going to answer the question, but before I answer the question, I need to say I am not a financially qualified person. I don't come from a financial background, and to get that question answered, as I suspect you would like it answered, I would need either my CFO or a member of my finance team to do it, or the chair of my audit committee who is also financially qualified. That doesn't mean I'm not going to answer it. I am going to answer it.
Can I just check, Ms Wilkinson, that you are a family director of the company?
I'm a family director of the company.
With the fiduciary duties that go with that?
I have the fiduciary, and of course that's why I'm going to answer the question, but I can't answer it from that financially qualified perspective. So my understanding as a director was that two things had to be true for us to sign off our accounts for that year end. One, we had to have sufficient cash and liquidity to ensure that we could continue to trade as a going concern, and the second one was that we had to have reasonable and achievable, sensible financial trading numbers that we were predicting we were going to deliver through 2023. We were put under enormous pressure by our then auditors, EY, to prove both of those things, that we would have adequate cash and that our numbers were reasonable and achievable. The adequate cash, as you've seen, because it's on record, was coming from either secured lending against our distribution centre in Worksop, or, as it transpired, a sale and leaseback of Worksop, and secondly through an ABL assets-based lending, which we secured ultimately through Wilko, which was secured against many things, but principally against, from memory, stock and intellectual property, but there were other things too within that. So on the one dynamic, we needed to prove to our auditors that we had sufficient cash. The second side of it was that we had to prove that we had reasonable and achievable trading numbers that we were likely to hit as we went through the financial year, which is 23. We ran more sensitised versions of those numbers than even I can remember, to do a worst case scenario, and then an even worse case scenario, and then an even worse case scenario.
Okay, well, can I just interrupt there, because we're up against time to some degree. But according to the Sunday Times, Wilko was advised in 2022 by restructuring advisors from Teneo to use a company voluntary arrangement to close some stores and renegotiate rents on others. How did you respond to that advice?
So, my understanding, because I was not directly involved with Teneo, in early...
But as a director...
As a director, it was reported to me at Holding Board, absolutely right. So, my understanding is that in early 2022, verbal discussions took place with Teneo about whether a creditors voluntary arrangement, a CVA, was an appropriate route for Wilko. And at that time, I understand that my CEO and my property director were told that it was not, because our financial position was not sufficiently bad to do a CVA. By September, I believe it was, of 2022, we had a long report into the Holding Board, and within that long report, as part of the contingency planning, if trading continued to deteriorate, a CVA was discussed. It was not proposed as a do-it-right-now scenario. It was proposed that if trading continued, it was a contingency plan.
Can I just ask you about that? But you say it wasn't to do it right now, but wasn't it the advice from Teneo to do it right now?
No, it was not. In November, they repeated the advice around a CVA, again as a contingency for if trading continued to decline. And the consensus was we did a step plan. Step number one was to do the secured lending or the sale and leaseback. Step number 2 was to do the ABL. Step number 3, to be planned in the first quarter of 2023, was to consider doing a CVA, with the suggestion that we would have an implementation date of April 2023, because that would release the most cash onto the balance sheet. My understanding is you get a better business rates position if we had done it at the beginning of April. I do not know the detail of it, but that is my understanding, which is what we did. So during the first quarter of 2023, we did the planning for a CVA. We did it at that point with PricewaterhouseCoopers, not with Teneo. And there was a subtle difference. In the original report, Teneo had believed that the CVA would be largely a pension scheme voted CVA, because it had the pension deficit as a very high figure in its report. As it transpired, that was not accurate. And we were doing predominantly a landlord-voted CVA. That meant we had to do a much tighter cost reduction programme in order to try to secure the votes of the landlords in favour of that CVA. And that took us over the April date in doing that cost-cutting exercise before we could put the CVA position before the landlords. But the nub of it is, did we listen to the advice and did we follow it? Yes, we listened to the advice. Yes, we followed it.
Okay, well, that's not everybody's interpretation of those events. And I'll perhaps put to you, Ms Wilkinson, and Mr Jackson. The Sunday Times quoted a restructuring source as saying Wilko failed due to naivety, incompetence, a failure to listen to people who've done these things for a long time, and just stubbornness, resulting in a complete car crash and the loss of a third-generation business which could have been saved. Mr Jackson, how accurate is that?
If that's referring specifically to the CVA, then it's inaccurate. I think...
No, it's referring to the failure of the business.
I mean, I can't comment on... I was appointed at Christmas 22, and I have to say that most of my time was spent looking forward on what needed to be done and at what pace.
So you had to look back to understand what had gone wrong, so how accurate is that characterisation?
You've heard different conjecture this morning, and I would call it conjecture. The reality is, at the end of January 21, the balance sheet of the business was pretty well placed. Well placed, okay, despite views on discounting versus value retail in the right or wrong place on the high street. All of those are issues, and they all impacted the business. But there was over 100 million of cash, over 100 million of P&L reserves. There, in my view, the biggest contributory factors to the cash outflow were, of course, the increased competition, but global supply chain issues, cost increases, failing to act on cost reduction, but most importantly, I believe that with hindsight, I would not have furloughed, I would not have stayed open. I would have taken advantage, protected the business on the furlough scheme and rents, like 90% of other retailers. There was a warehouse management system implementation that was nothing short of a disaster that led to a shortage of availability in store stock. Therefore,
Project Optimus, is it?
Yes. Project Optimus is a wider project that included spending £60 million on bringing warehouses up to scratch. So you can quickly see COVID impact of not furloughing. Yes, stayed open and traded, but cash was going out the door. The DC sale and leaseback became necessary, as did the ABL. The ABL gave us a window. When I came in, a sufficient window. It required a lot of things to be done quickly. But we took 90 million of costs out on an annualised basis. We planned very detailed a CVA with CBRE, who are the same people that Teneo would have used. There wasn't a change in strategy around the CVA. That fundamentally underpinned. So the 90 million of cost out of the structure, then 35 to 40 through a CVA, but most importantly, we had to get suppliers back on board. A large number of them had restricted credit or were on stop. If you read the press, then most of the sales shortfall in the last 2 years was driven by poor availability. It's poor availability because they didn't have the cash to pay the suppliers. So going through the ABL, taking all of the suppliers through the cost reduction programme, showing the window, showing that there was a planned CVA, it still required funding post-CVA. Actually, that turnaround plan could have been delivered. Actually, the biggest single factor in it not being delivered was news of the CVA leaking into the press, which made suppliers who had got back on board very nervous again, and availability started to fall, and then it became a vicious circle.
Ms Wilkinson, do you recognise that characterisation? And in addition, some informed observers felt that with a cost of living crisis and shoppers looking for bargains, this should have been Wilko's time to shine, as it's been described. Do you recognise that and the characterisation of others?
I recognise Mark's characterisation. I'm sorry, I forgot what your characterisation was in the first place.
Well, it was simply that the naivety and incompetence and failure to listen to people who had done these things for a long time, and stubbornness resulting in a complete car crash and the loss of a third-generation business which could have been saved. That's the charge that's put to you.
Well, I don't recognise not listening, no. I do recognise the devastation in losing a third-generation business. It is devastating. I don't know what you want me to say. You know, I do believe Wilko could have been saved, but it was not.
Mr. Gullis.
Thank you very much, Chair. Ms Wilkinson, I'm just a bit baffled because you've talked about 2022 a lot, and of course I totally accept that there were economic impacts external to the business that have impacted. But we heard from, I'm pretty sure it's Professor Shah, if not I apologise for the other panellists, pointed out in the first panel that in the audit accounts of 2018-19, in the last sentence of the going concern section, the financial viability of the business was in question. So why was that not acted upon, and why is it all the blame is being put on 2022? I feel a sleight of hand here. It's easy to point fingers at the government, it's easy to talk about COVID, it's easy to talk about cost of living. The reality is you had the warning signs in the last sentence. Was it simply a case that you and the directors didn't read the audit report?
I don't know how to answer that question. We did read the audit report. We are taken through the audit report by our auditors in holding board meetings. Whichever auditors we have, we go through that and we always scrutinise it. It is true that the trading position of Wilko's in terms of turnover was weakening over the years. I think we always scrutinised and took steps to address everything we could. We had relatively, not as strong trading performance, but we had relatively strong trading performance until we hit financial year 2022. So we're still in 2021, we're still taking 1.36 billion turnover. We've got EBITDA of 48.3 million. We've got net assets of 118.4 million. We're still in a relatively good position by the end of 2021. It is during 2022 that position declines.
The truth is, though, the warning signs were written in 2018 and action wasn't taken until 2022. So there's a 4-year period of inaction in essence, in my opinion. And Mr MacDonald earlier, who's no longer in his place, was just raising about the fact that you've been sort of warned about maybe looking at some of the high street shops and renegotiating the leases, and you said that the advice wasn't sort of told to do it now, it was just given to you. Well, when my partner tells me to put the rubbish out and I ignore it the first time, and then she tells me to put it out a second time, that means do it now. So I'm a bit confused when the business has repeated its advice twice, that's not been taken as a bit of a hint, at the very least, that you need to do something.
I'm sorry if I gave you the impression we weren't doing anything about the fact that we were over-rented and that our stores were in the wrong place. Of course we were. That was a active stream of work for as long as I can remember in reducing our lease obligations, and I would have to bring the relevant head in to enable you to have the detail. I just don't have the detail on that today, so I'm sorry. I thought you were referring to the more aggressive approach through the CVA mechanic, but yes, we had been working for many years to reduce our rent bill and to reduce the length of our leases and to get our stores into the right places. It was an ongoing job of work.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Mr. Jackson, was it your view that the Teneo advice was inaccurate?
I think we have to separate out. Was a CVA inaccurate? No. A CVA would have put the business in a much better position, but a CVA is an insolvency process. It's an insolvency process that requires funding on the other side, otherwise you won't get through it. Their analysis was incorrect. Their analysis, 75% of people who vote by value have to vote in favour for it to go through. Their analysis of voting had a pension scheme that could put it through on its own, and no other creditors mattered. The reality is that wasn't true, and that all landlords needed to be taken through, all suppliers did. So the planning detail behind a successful CVA was not the same as what Teneo had proposed.
Does that mean that, in your judgment, it couldn't be implemented?
No, it could have been implemented.
It could have been implemented.
But it couldn't have been implemented until you've got funding and you are insolvent. So it couldn't have been implemented when they recommended, which was back end of 22.
Could.
It couldn't have been done at the time. It was a deferred recommendation. It wasn't to do it now. Absolutely not. It couldn't. That's just impossible. You have to be insolvent to do a CVA. The business was not insolvent. It had a declining cash base. It had freehold property of £80 million in value. It wouldn't have been possible until all of those plans had been worked through.
Was there a way, therefore, to pursue that reform?
I believe so. Again, all of this is with hindsight. We had a window if we could have got suppliers on board. We then went to, with the detailed CVA plans, we went to at least 20 potential investors, both private equity and debt, and actually looking at full sale of the business. You had to get funding secured throughout the CVA process, because suppliers will say, oh, hang on, am I going to get paid only when I know that we got through this? And then you need funding the other side. That funding required a detailed plan, and we had funding agreed the other side, but the funding up front still required, we had an ABL agreed with Wilko. Wilko didn't want to be in the long term, so we had to get the two parties to work together. As time ran on, the lack of availability of stock in store made the position worse each day. But there was definitely a window where the turnaround could have been done. And actually the difference in funding that we could raise and the funding that was required is quite a bit less than the cost to the taxpayer.
Why was that opportunity not seized if there was a window of opportunity?
Because we couldn't get the funders to back it.
So it was an external constraint rather than a decision of the business?
Yes, absolutely. It was pursued. I knocked down an awful lot of doors more than once, and we had interested parties right up to the beginning of August who were really keen to save the business, and I thought still a very good chance of doing so.
And what was stopping these creditors?
Ultimately, the amount of security in the balance sheet was falling every day. So the amount of people who were secured lenders were prepared to lend was also reducing. The climate that we are in the UK economic climate, particularly for retail, with future cost increases. The investment community were not overly keen. So I could get about 15 million unsecured, and I could get 40 to 45 of secured lending, bringing a total of around 60, 65 maybe. 75 to 90 was the need.
You see our problem. Our problem is that in 2021, you've got 108 million in cash on the balance sheet. We've got a deterioration in trading conditions, but that affects every business on the high street. Other players seem to have been able to weather the storm, and you did not. So we're trying to understand why you didn't when others did, when you started with such a strong cash position.
I wasn't in the midst of the decision making, but if you can imagine paying rents, which I think are £90 million a year, not furloughing people, and spending 60 million on 2 warehouses, the impact of credit insurance being pulled, accelerating cash out to suppliers, that can happen quite quickly.
But those are all examples of management failure.
I wasn't there at the time, so I can't comment on the decisions
Ms.
and
Wilkinson,
the reasons why they were made.
You were there at the time, so why were those decisions taken?
So there are many decisions that Mark talked about. Which ones do you want me to
Well, let's
focus
go
on?
through all of them. So let's go through the furlough, let's go through the failure of Project Optimus. Let's start with those two.
So we took a decision to stay open. The history of Wilko is that it has always stayed open. It stayed open throughout World War II. It's always stayed open when challenges happen. We were an essential retailer. We debated at great length as a board whether we should stay open, and the decision we took was to stay open, to not furlough our team members, to support those who were medically vulnerable, and to pay our landlords in full. That is the decision we took.
And the warehouse project?
We have had 2 warehouses, DC1 and DC2. One is in Magor in Wales, one is in Worksop. The warehouse project was taken, there were 2 forms to the warehouse project. There was warehouse management system implementation across both distribution centres, and there was a relay of the racking and the layout of both distribution centres. That was taken many years ago, the decision to implement, and then was a phased programme that started with Magor, which was the smaller of the 2 distribution centres. So it was an implementation of warehouse management system and of relay of racking, and then that moved on to distribution centre 1. Clearly, it was done with the intention to improve at the processes in our warehouse. We had out-of-date machinery. It was very manual. We weren't as efficient as we could be, and a decision was taken by the board collectively as a capital investment to do that work.
So, Ms. Venning, what advice did you give to the business about the Teneo advice?
Well, firstly, thank you to the committee for inviting us here today to talk about our role as auditors of Wilko, and indeed on audit reform as well. We have listened quite carefully to the last panel and do welcome the opportunity to offer some corrections and to answer your questions. Turning to your specific question, Chair, it's not our role as auditors to offer advice to the company. The company will make management decisions. They are involved in the day-to-day running of the business. Our role as auditors is to assess the status of the business, the position of the business, and to come up with an independent view, an independent opinion as to whether the accounts as presented by management and signed off by the directors are indeed true and fair, and provide the users with an appropriate view in terms of the position that the company's in.
At no stage did you give advice about whether to pursue the kinds of ideas that were in the Teneo proposal?
It wasn't appropriate for us to do that in the role. As auditors, we wouldn't give advice on that. It's very important that we are independent.
Is that a no? Did you give advice on whether to pursue the Teneo proposal, yes or no?
It wasn't our role to do so.
Is that a no?
It's a no.
Okay, thank you. What advice did you give the business about the steps that it might need to take in order to remain a going concern, for example, around the sale of the warehouse?
So again, it's not our position as auditors to offer advice to the business. It would be highly inappropriate for us to do so. We are an independent body that assesses the decisions that management make in terms of how they feed themselves through into the accounts to be sure that they are true and fair. In terms of the assessment that we went through from a going concern perspective, I think it's very important actually for the committee to understand, and hopefully it's helpful for us to jump to what our opinion actually said in terms of our view, in terms of the position of the business. So if you wouldn't mind just for 2 minutes for me just to read out the very specific piece in our opinion. Yeah. I think it really is quite important actually, Chair, for the whole committee to understand the specific words that we said in our opinion, because I do think it frames the rest of the discussion that we'll have here today. So in our opinion, it says very clearly under the heading of material uncertainty related to going concern, it says at the date of approval of these financial statements, the group had insufficient committed financing in place to withstand a severe but plausible downturn in conditions, a severe but plausible downturn in trading activity through the going concern period to January 2024. These events and conditions indicate that a material uncertainty exists that may cast significant doubt on the group and company's ability to continue as a going concern. So, to the point that Mr. Shah raised in the first panel, this was not hidden away. This was not loose language. This was very, very clear language in our audit opinion that brought serious attention to the situation that the business found itself in, and drew the attention of the users to the fact that there was a plausible scenario whereby the company could run out of cash if sufficient financing wasn't raised.
So did you, before you published that judgment, did you warn Wilko's management that there was a risk that they were not going to meet the going concern test?
Yeah, so as part of our audit, we do a lot of work in terms of challenging management around the forecasts that they prepare. It's important for the committee to understand that the preparation of the forecasts are management's responsibility. Our role as auditors is to challenge those, to challenge all the assumptions within them. So our audit for the January 2022 year end started in May of 2022, and we obtained those forecasts that management had prepared and set about assessing whether the assumptions within them were appropriate. We do that in a number of ways. So we do that by looking back at the historical accuracy of management's forecasting. We look at what industry predictions are saying around the business and around the sector, and we use our own understanding of the business and indeed involve our internal retail specialists to help us with that. And when we did all of that work, we concluded that the forecasts that management had prepared at the time were optimistic, and we challenged management to go away and revise those forecasts to take account of some of the challenges that we'd raised in relation to the assumptions. That process went on for a number of months. It was an iterative process where we continued to challenge management around the forecasting that they had presented to us. We ended up with 4 different versions of the forecasts and found ourselves in September with a sort of final position that had been put forward by management, which we still considered could be even more severe. So they went away diligently and prepared a final forecast for us, which in our view took account of the sort of severe but plausible downside that could be experienced in the business. And only at that point, actually, were we prepared to sign our opinion to conclude that the financial statements that the directors had prepared were true and fair.
And that last scenario entailed the sale of the warehouse?
The last scenario included the sale of the warehouse because that had happened in November before we signed off.
I think what we're struggling to understand is how you've got a set of accounts which are obviously bleeding cash pretty quickly at this stage. We've got some of the challenges around getting further agreements with creditors on board, and the accounts are basically being plugged with a one-off sale of a warehouse. and yet a going concern judgment is given?
So I come back to the fact that the going concern assessment, that is a basis of preparation of accounts that is dictated within the accounting standards. Our audit opinion drew a serious warning flag to the users of the accounts around the risks that were very plausible risks in the business. When we signed the accounts, there was £58 million worth of cash in the business. Part of that was from the sale and leaseback, but equally part of that was part of the receipts from the sale and leaseback went to repay the RCF. So, you know, we got to a place where we were comfortable that the audit opinion that we signed, and we still stand by today, was the right opinion because it drew the user's attention to the serious warning flag. Just to the comment that Mr. Shah made earlier.
Bust and you signed off the accounts and you stand by that judgment? That's an extraordinary conclusion.
We don't sign off the accounts. The directors sign off the accounts. We sign an audit opinion.
Signed it off as a going concern.
The directors sign the accounts as a going concern. We offer an opinion in relation to whether that set of accounts is true and fair. And in terms of the various other options that were available to us that Professor Shah mentioned earlier, the other options we had in terms of signing our opinion could have entailed, firstly, a clean opinion with no reference to any warning signs in the business at all, or it could have been a disclaimed opinion. And we issue a disclaimed opinion if we don't have access to the books and records sufficient to be able to make our judgment. Or the third option would be an adverse opinion, which was the one that Professor Shah was alluding to. That opinion would have only been relevant in one of three situations. Firstly, the company had already taken the decision to put the business into liquidation. Secondly, the directors had already taken the decision to cease trade in the business, or the third option would have been that the directors had no realistic alternative other than to do so. So that is the criteria that we were assessing at the date of our sign-off. And to have concluded with an adverse opinion at that point would have been a very extreme view. There were realistic alternatives for the business. You've heard today from management and also from the previous panel that this was not inevitable. There were options that the business was pursuing. There were financing options. There were a number of cost-cutting initiatives that were already in train, as well as growth opportunities. So for us to give that opinion would have been the wrong answer, so we stand by the opinion that we gave.
Okay, so Ms Wilkinson, what advice?